Hello, Kids Cook Real Food. Katie Kimball here for the Healthy Parenting Connector, where, as always, my goal is to connect you, parents who really want to raise independent, healthy adults, with the experts who have the information that's going to open up your mind and give you new direction and great ideas. I'm so thrilled to have another returning guest, Phyllis Fagell. We've heard from her about middle school, particularly this middle school crowd a couple years ago. And, I don't have that many people back for two times. And so that means Phyllis is amazing, really good. She's one of those interviews that my own brain in my parenting has gone back to time and time again. So thank you so much for being here with us, Phyllis.
Thank you for bringing me back.
So Phyllis has a new book out, and both of her books are about middle schoolers, but don't hit stop yet if you don't have a middle schooler, because as it turns out, middle schoolers are humans too. And there's a lot of what we're going to talk about today that applies to many ages of humans, even the grown-up kind. So let me officially introduce our guest, and then we will jump right in. Phyllis Fagell is a nationally board certified school counselor, a therapist who works with kids and families in private practice in Maryland, an educational consultant, and an author and journalist. She's the author of two best-selling books, Middle School Matters, which we talked about last time. So guys, especially if you do have a middle schooler, go back and listen also to the first interview, because it's going to intersect really well with this one. Her second book that we're talking about today is Middle School Superpowers, and she's a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, as well as occasionally Psychology Today, CNN, Working Mother, US News and World Report, and Your Teen. In other words, you can find her in all sorts of fancy places. Phyllis is also a speaker to schools and organizations all across the country and the world on a big range of topics, including counseling, education, and parenting. And she's got 3 kids and a husband to keep her accountable. So we're going to jump right in. When I think of middle school, and I think many adults may be similar, especially the female version of adults, if I may be so bold to say that middle school is harder for girls. When we think of middle school, it's not usually our favorite time of our lives. What is still the same for this next generation, Phyllis? And what has changed to make middle school either better or potentially even more challenging, if that's possible, than our day?
Yes, I think it is actually seismically different. Obviously, the developmental stage is the same. So you still have kids who have brains that are still under construction. They're experiencing emotions as a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. They are in the throes of puberty. Whether or not they have the physical changes, their brains are already changing. Those hormones are coursing. So they often feel like a stranger to themselves. And they're exquisitely sensitive and very aware of how they stack up to others. That insecurity is something that's timeless, unfortunately, for human children of any age. You have to go through that phase. What's different is the setting in which they're growing up and some of the conditions. So there are so many more distractions. They are dealing with a social life that doesn't end when they go home. They don't get a break, especially for those who have devices and social media. They're constantly plugged in and aware of who is doing what with whom or without them, who is doing what they do, only better or looking better. And something like 80% of all images are filtered, photoshopped. So they're also subjected to these really unrealistic images of perfection. And then on top of that, we have a lot of global instability, cultural division, increase in gun violence, this huge spike in mental health problems that predates the pandemic, and the list goes on. It's really hard not only to be a tween, but to parent one right now.
Mm, it sure is. When we think about sort of the global events, let's start there. Is there anything parents can do to create a buffer zone? Because I mean, I don't know about other parents, but my 12 and 13-year-old, like, I don't really need them to know yet about global scary political things going on. Do you have any recommendations for that?
The number one thing is that we are aware of what they are seeing and hearing online, because if it's something that they think we will be shocked that they heard or saw, or if they really can't make sense of it, they're not going to ask us to help them make sense of it. So we want to have that awareness of what they're taking in. And then once we have that information, we can have a conversation with them about whether it's serving them. Often it hasn't even occurred to them that they can take a step back, that they can avoid certain apps, that it may actually be creating anxiety. Kids this age worry about everything. And so we want them to be thinking critically about that information. We can't prevent them from getting it. It's going to happen, but we can have those conversations and help them create policies or have systems in place that buffer them against some of it.
Sure. So maybe they don't have a news app on their phone, or maybe they don't have a phone at all. What a crazy idea that would be for middle school.
Crazy idea. And they can even monkey with the algorithms a little bit, because whatever you're looking at, you get more of. So if you look at my Instagram, and I've showed this to my own 15-year-old, it is all dogs, some babies thrown in for good measure,
Okay.
because I love to look at funny dog videos, and then they just feed me more. So the more you're looking at disturbing things, the more disturbing things you're going to be getting.
That is good for anyone to remember, right? That it's not necessarily about just taking a break from the app, but figure out how to make it work for you. Do you recommend that parents look at kids' text messages, browser history, stuff like that?
I am not huge on surveillance, but I am big on spot checking, especially if your kid is struggling with using these apps in an appropriate way, either because they are losing too much sleep because they are giving so much of themselves to friends and they can't log off, or because they're seeing things that are disturbing. Whatever the reason is, even if it's simply curiosity, again, going back to what they're looking at, so you can have those conversations, you want to have at least a snapshot of what their experience is online, and be very clear that you're doing that. It shouldn't come off as snooping, and let them know that you're not doing it to catch them doing something bad, but in order to be able to have conversations with them about how they're using that app or that set of apps that they have on their phone, or their texts. Those can go awry too.
Absolutely. And so many people say we as parents need to be their prefrontal cortex all the way through high school too. So it's not like, I love that you said, I'm not trying to catch you do something bad. I'm trying to help you be your filter, learn to filter, right? Learn to think critically.
Yes, and as they hit high school, you don't need to be doing that in the same way. You're going to start scaffolding it when they're young, and as you see them using it responsibly, independently, without any need for assistance, then you can pull away.
Okay, great structure for parents. It's so easy, Phyllis, especially with middle school and the world we live in and social media, to just talk about the negative. But your book is really all about the positive. It's about superpowers that middle schoolers have. Can you unpack that a little bit? Why you chose to focus on superpowers and what they are?
Sure. So there are 12, and the 12 I chose are useful for kids and adults of any age. But the reason I highlighted the ones I chose is because they're particularly useful for middle schoolers. So I'll give you a few examples. One is super belonging, which is the power to find your place and feel a sense of belonging. And there's no other time in a kid's life when they more desperately want to fit in, or when friendships are any more important. This is it. This is the apex of when they care about their friends. And so that is a huge one, especially if their social skills are still developing. So I really get into concrete social skills and how we can help kids connect with peers. Then I have one that is super optimism, and that's about retaining hope and a sense of humor during the hard times, which is really hard if you're 13 and you're dropped by a friend and you've never had that happen before, and you have no way of knowing that it's going to be okay on the other side. I have super sight, which is about anticipatory decision making and the ability to make a plan, because again, kids in this age group, their brains are under construction. They're very impulsive. It's hard for them to even guess how their actions will turn out on the other side. So we really have to give them some frameworks for that decision making. And then there are lots of other ones, all of which are couched in that developmental phase.
And Phyllis, are these superpowers things that middle schoolers naturally have, or what parents need to help them build in this critical time of middle school?
So all kids have strengths, and we will always get farther if we work with their existing strengths. So as you're reading this book, you might say, you know what, my kid is really, really good at making friends, at recovering from social setbacks, this is really not the area where they need the most support. You might not need to spend as much time with that skill set. But if you have a kid who, let's say, has a really hard time with transition and change and going to a new school, or going from being in person in school to homeschooling, or vice versa, or going to a summer camp, or just joining a new group of kids in a team sport is really hard for them, then the superpower, that super flexibility, which is the ability to manage change, is going to be one that you would want to bolster. So it's not about going to your kid and saying, you know what, you don't have the ability to bounce back from setbacks, so we're going to work on super bounce. It's about picking and choosing the areas that you can really help them bolster their skills. There's a lot of misconceptions about resilience, that resilience is something you're born with. And it's not, it's really a skill set that can be taught, that can be strengthened. And so everybody is resilient in some ways and less resilient in others. And what we can do, and what is such a huge gift to our kids, is to figure out the areas where it's harder for them to get back on their feet and give them some tools to be able to do that.
I would love to hear like a kind of a story, practical example
Yes.
of how a parent can build. Maybe it's the flexibility in the face of change, or like a kid gets a bad grade. There are so many ways that middle schoolers can, and anyone really, can react to getting a bad grade. What do we do as parents to scaffold what they need?
Yes. So, first you want to be acknowledging that it was painful. You always want to start with validation, whatever the setback is, whatever the disappointment is, that must feel really bad. And I can imagine you're feeling pretty stuck. If you have a kid who concludes, I'm awful at math because I didn't do well on that test, there's no point in trying. What we want to be doing is helping them think about the things that they can control and the things that matter. And the sweet spot is really that area in between. If you think about it like a Venn diagram, and in that situation, what can they control? They can control whether they study in a group next time. They can control whether they are able to distract themselves so that they're able to focus on other things. They can focus on whether they go in to see the teacher and ask for help. If, let's say, they're upset because they were docked 1 point on a quiz and it's an inconsequential quiz, but they're all worked up and their reaction is too emphatic for the situation, that's when you might help them realize that it doesn't matter. Yes, there are things you can do. You could go argue with your teacher. You could make your case for that 1 point, but thinking ahead, what might happen as a result? It might annoy the teacher. It might not get you the long-term result you're looking for. So always we're going to be looking for ways that we can help kids identify that sweet spot between the things they can control and the things that matter. We also want them to conserve their energy. Another practical example would be in how they talk to themselves. So if they say, I'm never going to be good at math, you can try adding on a sentence stem like, it's also possible that, and ask them to try to complete that sentence. And I always preface an exercise like that with something like, I don't need you to believe it. Because whenever we're having kids do something along those lines, what we're really trying to do is teach them cognitive flexibility so they don't go straight to the worst case scenario, and so that they can then transfer that skill to other situations. And
So
I'll
you would
share a
say,
story.
oh,
Yes.
I'd love to hear it, but you would say, I don't need you to believe this, but it's also possible that you'll get better at math. Is that the order?
Yes. Yes, that's exactly how you should do it. I'll give you a practical example with a real student. He was upset that he was not invited to a hangout on a Friday night. And he was sure that meant that they wanted to talk about him behind his back, that they didn't want to be his friend anymore. His mind was going to all of those worst case scenarios. And the fact that nobody had texted him or told him about it felt even worse. And so I did a similar exercise with him. I said, I want you to come up with 3 more benign possibilities other than they hate you and they want to talk about you behind your back. And again, I said, you don't have to believe them. And that's really critical because often they don't believe the answers that they come up with. And it's really hard for them to generate them if they have to have that pressure to believe it. So he took a little time to think about it. And eventually he said, all right, maybe they all were at baseball practice together because I know they're on the same team. And they just kind of ended up hanging out. It just sort of happened. And it wasn't that they didn't want me. It was just that they didn't really think about me in that moment since they were already together. And then he looked up at me and said, I think that's what happened. So that was a great outcome. But even if he hadn't believed that, it can help him think more flexibly in the future. And when kids can assume positive intent, or when they can be more optimistic, which means that you think about problems as being temporary and situational rather than permanent and pervasive, then they have a much gentler middle school experience.
A gentle middle school experience. Put that on a placard, right? Like, Phyllis, I feel like perhaps multiple superpowers were demonstrated sort of in those strategies. Can you tell us which ones that you just sort of unpacked for us?
Yes, sure. So the positive intent that comes from super belonging, because there are so many situations in which kids feel socially snubbed. And no doubt it's painful, but it's also universal. I'm always front loading for kids that they will get dropped by a friend in middle school, because if they know it's coming, they actually can emotionally prepare for it and they have an easier time managing it when it happens. The sentence stem, it's also possible that is from super optimism and the ability to see these problems, these situations that you're going through as something that you can handle, that you can come out on the on the other side. This is not an obstacle that will defeat you. Let's see, what else did I have in there? It's also possible that is sort of similar to a set of strategies I use in super bounce, which is when kids themselves make mistakes, we want them to be having that path back to being, a so-called good kid. So helping them repair what happened, helping them debrief, thinking about what they just experienced and what they could have learned from that experience is a really useful exercise to do with kids. And sometimes that can be done with those kinds of sentence starters or sentence completers. One more related to that on the super optimism is to have kids, especially the kids with Eeyore Syndrome, which is those relentlessly negative kids, have them keep lists of 5 things that happened that were funny, or 5 ways they helped somebody, 5 ways they contribute to the household. There are endless variations of that, but really teaching them to think about things in a different way.
That one, the Eeyore syndrome. I took me a minute to realize what you were saying. Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh.
Yes.
Totally have one of those, maybe 2 in my household. And this feels a little similar to what a lot of even practitioners and mental health professionals say, that gratitude
Yes.
to be part of the day. You're just sort of making a really specific sort of gratitude list.
Yes, and that's another example. You can make a list of things you're grateful for too. It's about challenging that negativity that is so pervasive with kids in this age group. They're relentlessly self-critical too, and we want them to be talking to themselves the way they would talk to a friend, because middle schoolers are actually incredibly encouraging and nurturing of their friends. And simply giving them a little emotional distance and saying, how would you advise a friend? Or if something doesn't go well and they can't think of any potential solutions, to say, if you were to ask somebody else, your teacher, a friend to whom this seems easy or comes easy, what do you think they would say that you could do to maybe take it from a 9 on a scale of 1 to 10 in awfulness down to a 7 or an 8?
Right. I mean, that's brilliant to have kids think of it from in the mind of someone else, or how they would treat someone else. Because we do, and adults treat ourselves worse than we do other people. I can absolutely see what you're saying, that these superpowers they're cross ages. They're not age dependent at all. What do you think is special about the middle school years as far as an opportunity for parents, that we can't pass this up?
So something I talk about in the book is that there's this trope about middle school in this phase, that it's the age of embarrassment. And sure, that spotlight effect, that imaginary audience is real, but I consider it the age of opportunity, because you have these kids who are still very malleable, very impressionable. Their brains are totally under construction. They very much care what their parents think, even if it doesn't seem like they're listening, they're taking it all in and incorporating those values. And we can set them up to have years and years of, again, going back to that idea of gentler middle school, not just gentler middle school, but gentler high school, gentler college, setting them up for success later by giving them these skills now when they will really take.
And I know you use the phrase the last best chance,
Yes.
right?
By the time they get to high school, it's not that we don't have influence, but they have pulled away a lot more. They've identified much more with their friend groups by then. Those friend groups are much more solidified. And when they're in middle school and everything is in flux from their bodies to their friends, and they're so needy and it's so messy, it's an opportunity to take all of those obstacles, all of those things that are hard, and actually use them to develop their resilience, to use those as opportunities as well.
Yeah, it's I need you to repeat for all the parents of middle schoolers out there that they actually care what the parents think.
They do. They really do. There's nothing worse than disappointing a parent. It's why I always tell parents to practice having that, poker face. And if you are going to have a big reaction because you're disappointed in them or shocked, to make sure you process first with somebody else so that you can be really calm and non-reactive with your kid. Always start with things that come from a place of curiosity rather than judgment, because they are studying us all the time to see what we are thinking. And in fact, this comes from Middle School Matters from my first book, but one of the experts I interviewed for that book, this really stuck with me, pointed out that when kids argue with you, it's actually a sign of respect because they care what's going on in your head and they're arguing to try to figure out what you think.
Wow. That's one to tuck away. They're not necessarily pushing you away. They're inviting conversation. Just feels like an argument.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot. Parenting, I mean, good thing our prefrontal cortex is fully developed, even though it may not feel like it some days, because I think it's a big thing for parents to have to process and think through and be non-reactive ourselves. So bravo, really, like we have to say to parents too, like, yes, this is hard.
It's so
It's okay
hard.
if it feels hard.
It is. And actually, in this book, which I didn't do in the last one, I tried to include a lot more for parents themselves. Number one, because none of us really learned any of this stuff when we were growing up. It just wasn't the way anyone really talked about mental health or resilience. Number two, kids, they catch all of our emotions. Emotions are contagious. And it's really hard to be a human, not just a middle schooler. And so I share 2 tips that I think are really helpful for adults. It's something I try to incorporate in my own life. The first is to make sure you set aside time once a week to have a substantive conversation with someone who you know cares about you, because that has been shown to be such a huge booster of resilience in adults. And the second is kind of cliche, and I hate saying self-care because it's overused, but part of self-care, beyond the typical things like sleep and good nutrition and all of those things, is recognizing that we cannot be everything to our kid, and it is okay to outsource some of these conversations to people who might be able to handle it better. And it's important to tell our kids that we're okay with them going to another adult and even brainstorming who that might be in those situations.
Well, that's fantastic. And I don't think that is ever on the list of like your standard sort of self-care, because I agree with you. I cringe with that phrase, but it can be done well. It just isn't always done well, right?
Yes, yes. And it's not the same for everybody. It's not one size fits all.
Mm-hmm. Now, so speaking, it is sort of related to self-care. When we think about our kids and how well they are able to care for, or are taking the time for, or are trained to care for their own, say, mental health or even physical health, we know the statistics are terrible, right?
Yeah.
We're recording this interview post-pandemic. We got a little bit of a buffer from the pandemic, but it still feels like in the headlines, it's kind of this like could be looming again thing that if the kids are reading the news, it's there. But we know that stats on like depression, suicidal tendencies, anxiety, they were not doing well before the pandemic. The pandemic sort of added fuel to that fire. How do parents help kids who are really perhaps clinically or on the edge of those sort of kind of like depression, self-harm areas in middle school?
That is really about super vulnerability. We want to make sure we're teaching kids when they're calm, that it's important to ask for help. It's not intuitive for a middle schooler to ask for help in the first place, to reinforce that they should be asking an adult rather than another seventh grader who is probably dealing with their own stuff. And we want them to be doing that when they're not in crisis. So all of that is super important with a middle schooler, especially since they're not even good at labeling their feelings in the first place, which brings me to a second superpower, which is super healing. And that is about self-regulation and having coping strategies sort of for dealing with the smaller stuff. And then tied back into super vulnerability and that idea of making sure our kids can get the support that they need when they need it, which, by the way, might rise to the level of professional support, a therapist, or it could be somebody in a related field. It could be an occupational therapist, a speech pathologist, a social skills group, whatever that support might be, is something called super security. And at an age when kids are so insecure and hard on themselves, and at a time when they're hearing so much negativity targeted at kids that is rooted in identity-based issues, whether it has to do with their gender or their sexuality or their race or their religion, all of that is happening in their lives at a time when they're trying to figure out who they are and who they want to be. And so we can shield them from many of the really serious mental health issues if we can help them develop that really strong sense of self. So that's what that chapter is about, helping them have a really strong and healthy sense of self-esteem. Going full circle back, that is related to how they use social media as well. The ability to say, you know, this app isn't working for me, can help them preserve their self-esteem.
Well, it brings just a sort of a balm to my mama heart to hear you use that word shield. Like that sort of emboldens me, like, oh, I can shield them from what everyone else is saying. If the middle schoolers are forming their identity, would it be fair to say that we as parents really want to be part of that, so that it's that our family values and not sort of the noise out there?
Yes, if you're not having those conversations with them, they are going to get their information from elsewhere. And as I mentioned earlier, that could be photoshopped images that make them feel bad about their body. It could be that from what they see on TV, it looks like everybody else is super good, great at school, and they're the only one who struggles in a particular subject, and maybe they have a learning issue that they're sensitive about. And so we want to be using really positive language and bringing out what they're seeing, whether or not it is an accurate representation, making sure that they understand that everybody struggles with something, showing them really positive examples of people who fall into whatever that category might be. In Middle School Superpowers, I talk about a girl who has a middle schooler who has a website, I think it's called Throwing Lefty, and she had lost an arm. And so she has a video series where she shows kids how to do things without the use of her other arm. And it's this really empowering example. Whether it's a peanut allergy or seizures or dyslexia, we want to make sure that kids are seeing positive examples of people who they can relate to.
Yeah, I feel like there's a potential for a power struggle here, because sometimes when kids are forming their identity, they do go to social media or they go to friends, and is there an opportunity, and probably a right way and a wrong way, for parents to help share our values, whatever those are, if the child seems to be trying to choose an identity that is opposite that, whether it's, you know, something truly dangerous like substances, or something we just disagree with like tattoos, or the kids they're hanging out with, or some ideology that they're adopting. Like, how do we say, hey, that isn't how our family does it, and without creating that intense power struggle of them just saying no and doing whatever the opposite of whatever we say?
So I have an exercise that I recommend in the book, and it's called the values card sort. And the way it works is that you print out a list of it, maybe 50 to 100 values. And I took mine that are in the book from a combination of the actual values card sort, which you can Google, and from Brene Brown's Daring Greatly list of values. So there are things like creativity and nurturing and exploration, risk-taking, fun, responsibility, generosity, compassion, all the kinds of values that you can potentially imagine would be on a list like that. And print it out print out 2 copies, one for you and one for your child, and sit next to one another, have them choose the 10 values that most reflect the kind of person they want to be and how they want to show up in the world. Simultaneously, you're doing the same thing. And then have a conversation about why you chose your values and have them share why they chose theirs. Because then you're not lecturing and telling them what they should value, but you're getting an insight into what's important to them, and you're creating a very safe way for them to hear what's important to you. You can't foist your values on someone, but because they care so much what their parents think, they're likely to internalize them and be listening very carefully when you share what's important to you and why it's important to you. And taking it a step further with kids, one of the things I tell my students to do is to hang on to those values, because at a time when you are really inexperienced, you don't have a lot of perspective, there's a lot of interference, it could be jealousy, it could be wanting to fit in, it's hard to make good decisions. So if you're on the fence, if you're not sure if writing a particular post or saying something to someone or going to that party is going to serve you, after you've decided what you want to do, go back to that list and look at those 10 values you had chosen, which might change over time, and consider which of the choices that's in front of you is best aligned or most aligned with those values. And when kids do it, it gives them that structured framework. It eliminates all the interference. And more often than not, it makes them think twice about what the decision is that they had chosen.
That is fascinating and powerful. And I'm thinking back to something you said way back at the beginning of the interview too, is that we have to approach our kids with curiosity. So I think, in the example of, like, I'm not sure about this new friend or new friend group that my kids have chosen, rather than saying, I forbid you to hang out with them, or they are not the right kind of people. Curiosity, probably a better approach to just ask questions, and using those values as a great platform too.
Yes. And you can ask questions too that are things like, I'm wondering if this friendship serves you. It seems like you're doing all the emotional labor. I've noticed that they are constantly asking you to support them. Does it feel balanced to you? Do you feel like you're getting what you need from them, as opposed to that person's a terrible friend and you should walk away? Right. And often when we approach it that way, we also teach them how to set those healthy boundaries. And super force field is a superpower in the book too. And they can take that and use it to maybe take a little longer to reply to a text, or have a personal policy that they don't check texts after a certain time at night. And that's protective in and of itself. And it also helps them maybe not burn a bridge, which we don't want kids doing. We want them to maybe create some more space and pull away, because those friendships do cycle in and out, and they might be interested later. And kids really do change.
Oh, so good. And I wonder, we'll have to go back to the interview and count. Did we get all 12? Because I feel like we've got to be getting close.
I have the book in front of me, so I'm going to peek at the 12. I'll read them real quick for you.
Okay. Yeah.
And okay, so we've got super belonging, which we did. That was the power to find your place and make strong connections. Super sight, the power to anticipate problems and make a plan. Super vulnerability, the power to know when and how to ask for help. Super bounce, the power to learn and recover from missteps. Super agency, the power to find your purpose and take initiative. Super force field, the power to set healthy boundaries. Super security, the power to take pride in your identity and step into someone else's shoes. Super healing, the power to cope and self-regulate emotions. Super balance, the power to set a reasonable pace and realistic goals. And I see the one we forgot, because we did do super optimism, which is the hope and humor and the hard stuff. The one we forgot that is probably one of the most important is super daring. Ooh. The power to go out on a limb and take smart risks, because this is an age when it's so easy to be discouraged or to shy away from a challenge because you don't want to be embarrassed, whether that's raising your hand in class or inviting someone over. And we want to be giving kids tools to help them set those brave goals and take those risks.
It's so funny. My youngest is 8. He's a 3rd grader, and he was filling out a piece of paper just yesterday, like a beginning of the year thing from the kids to the teacher, right? My favorite this, my favorite that, words that describe me. And he wanted to find a word for the quality that he has of, I try things, I say yes to everything. And I couldn't actually think of a word, but I guess daring probably is it. I came up with eager, and I knew it wasn't what I wanted.
Courageous. He's brave.
Yeah. And it's
Uh,
so interesting because that is
regardless,
harder. I've seen not all my kids, I've seen some of my kids lose that in
they
that middle
do.
school time.
Around age 9 even is when they start to really be worried about whether their skills match their classmates.
Oh,
So by middle of third, fourth grade, you have a situation where kids do start to shy away from risks. Girls' confidence drops by, gosh, I think it's 46%
oh,
in middle school years, but it doesn't have to be that way, which is partially why I wrote this book. We can really help them preserve their confidence and help them continue to take those risks, because confidence comes from taking risks and seeing that you can come through something, whether or not it's successful.
yeah. We talk about my community and I talk a lot about acceptable risk when it comes to cooking because we've got knives, we've got
Yeah.
fire, we've got stuff that you can totally mess up a recipe and waste ingredients, and how do we help our kids take those risks? And I do feel like it's a little bit of a safer space. There's no one watching you. There's no social, issues happening in the kitchen. And so that's where we like to say that extrapolates onto their confidence level in other areas of life when they can practice taking these at-home risks.
It really does. Risks are transferable. I work with kids in private practice who have some social phobia,
Mhm.
and it's really hard for them to do things like walk through a hallway with 100 people surrounding them, or stir up a conversation during recess. They might rather hide in a bathroom. And we have to remember just how, even for a kid who doesn't have that level of challenge, social risks are so hard. So we might say something in a really well-meaning way, like, why don't you just call them, invite them over? And there might be 20 different steps before then. So here's a practical strategy you can try with your kid. Make a ladder, draw a ladder, and divide up the risk taking into all the rungs on the ladder, and then even add another rung between those rungs to really reinforce that it can take a long time to master a skill or to develop the courage to do something, and celebrate every single accomplishment that they hit along the way, so that they don't just bow out and think they should have reached for the moon and achieved getting it right away, that they can take a long time, and that's okay too.
Oh man. And as we sort of tie a bow on this, we walked through all 12 bits and pieces, all 12 superpowers. It has to be said that this really is sort of a global book. Like, these superpowers are helpful for all ages and stages, and they're like the right jet fuel. If you can figure some of these out, or at least take many steps on some of these superpowers while you're in middle school, right? This is just going to help smooth out the rest of life. This is like life skills 101, 201, and 301.
100%. I joked with my own 3 kids that if anything ever happens to me, to pick up this book, because this is my manifesto. This is really where my whole philosophy, it's obviously evidence-based and a researched book, but there's so much of what, the wisdom that we gain as we get older, and the things that I wish I had known when I was younger. I tried to infuse this book with all of those strategies.
It's just so fantastic. So for all of our listeners who are putting this book in the cart and wondering, do I get both books? How are they different? Yes, both books. Middle School Matters is more of the practical, granular, kind of day-to-day activity stuff. Middle School Superpowers is that 30,000-foot view, that more holistic self issues that we all really need, but they need it most in middle school. Let's end, Phyllis, because I know your first book was pre-pandemic. They're mid. This is post-pandemic, and things have really changed. I know I was talking with a teacher just a month ago who said, every grade, like whatever grade the child was in the depth of the pandemic, they, as a cohort group, sort of had different reactions. I was fascinated. She said the kids who were like juniors and seniors have become the most apathetic crowd that don't care, nothing matters. The kids who missed sort of that third, fourth grade year, they're really struggling with learning in general, because that's when you shift from learning to read to reading to learn. And she said each sort of slice of of children has a sort of different challenges coming out of the pandemic. So I'm really curious to know what you see as far as, middle schoolers now in a post-pandemic world. What are their additional challenges? But also, the kids who are current right now in 2023, sophomores and juniors, were middle schoolers in the depths of the
Yeah.
pandemic. How did that affect them?
So I have one of those in my house.
Uh-huh. Me too.
Yeah, so he is 15 and he went home in the middle of 6th grade. And at one point I joked with him, oh, you get to bypass 7th grade. How many kids would want to bypass 7th grade? And what I realized when he got to 9th grade is that no one gets a pass on 7th grade. You're going to experience all of those growing pains, all of those developmental milestones, all of those social shifts that happen just a little bit later. And the way that I see the kids that are now sophomores, juniors, freshmen in high school, they also, I think, really appreciate the social connections because they came home at a time when they didn't have the skills to really connect with their peers in the absence of face-to-face or structured activities. So they didn't get as much practice. They are still making up for lost time. Their social needs are probably greater than kids' social needs have been at that age in the past. It's not all bad though, because there's that gratitude that I think it's not just the kids who are juniors and seniors who have that now that they're, and I've got those kids too. I had one kid who was a senior and one kid who was a junior in 20 and 21. So all three of them in my house, at least, I see that they're on the other side and they're doing better. I would say that's also true for the most part of all of the kids I work with, whether it's in the school or private setting. Everybody's moving, inching toward better, but there's a lot of residual trauma that is still getting ironed out. There are a lot of skills that still need to be strengthened, whether it's executive functioning or social skills. And the more we can do those, that is how we can help our kids. The more we can do to give them the practical skills that they need to make up for that lost time, the faster they will fully be, hopefully on the other side of it, but without losing that gratitude.
And the resilience that all of these superpowers help build is critical to making it. It's critical to getting through high school and life.
Yes, the superpowers I chose were really in response to the last few years. The kids who did well were the kids who had these superpowers. And so I want all kids to have these superpowers.
Oh, as do we as parents. Phyllis Fagell, this has been a great discussion. Your superpowers are fantastic. Everyone, go buy both books, whether you have a middle schooler or a high schooler who's, right now still struggling with some of those middle school things. And for ourselves, I need to work on a lot of those superpowers as well. So my self-talk will likely change, in the next few weeks. So incredible. Thank you so very much. And I wish you well with all the new book stuff.
Thank you so much for having me on. Again, I'm honored.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Kids Cook Real Food listeners, this is Katie Kimball for the Healthy Parenting Connector, and I will see you back next time with another expert who has new information you need to raise those healthy, independent kids all the way to adulthood.